Lovable tricksters, stalwart defenders of gardens, fearless inventors, and masters of living the good life. Gnomes can do it all. In this video, I'm going to talk about the history of gnomes in our own human folklore, and where they were introduced in Dungeons & Dragons. And not only what their role is in D&D, but how it's somehow linked to an ancient fertility god. I am the Common House Bard, and this is a brief history of gnomes. Gnomes as we know them seem to originate from a published work in 1566 from Switzerland. The title of the book was A Book on Nymphs, Sylphs, Pygmies, and Salamanders, and the Other Spirits. Yes, that was the full title. Now you may notice I didn't actually use the term gnomes in the title at all. And that's because at the time, the word pygmy kind of encompassed, that was this catch-all word that encompassed everything that was sort of a short humanoid. Which makes sense because it comes from the Greek word pygmaios, which means no longer than the forearm. And that also makes sense because gnomes were described as somewhere between 2 spans and 3 dodrins, which comes out to about somewhere between 18 to 27 inches, which probably explains the tall hats. The author was a Swiss physician and alchemist who was known as Paracelsus. Although his full name is awesome, and it even kind of sounds gnomish. Okay, get ready for it. The guy who wrote the first book on gnomes was named Philippus Aurelius Theophrastus Bombastus von Hohenheim. I mean, come on. Like, if that's your name, you have to write a book on gnomes. I mean, also throwing salamanders in there is kind of objectively funny. But my favorite factoid about this book is that it was published posthumously. That means that when Paracelsus died, there was probably a relative that was going after the funeral to go help tidy up his house and sort out through his affairs. And he just comes across this book written all about gnomes and other fae folk. I just imagine them finding it and opening it up and going, oh, look, our grandfather, who was a doctor, who also pioneered the modern field of toxicology, that is a true fact, he also wrote a book about gnomes and salamanders. This guy is definitely getting a spot at my dream D&D table. Now, the historians among you might be thinking, but certainly there were sort of short, pygmy-like, gnome-like creatures that existed in the ancient world before Mr. von Hohenheim. And you are right, but the modern iteration of what we consider gnomes seems to have come out of that book in Switzerland. But it's still a valid argument to say that what we consider gnomes still have traces in the ancient world, like your proto-gnomes, if you will. In Rome, for example, people would place small idols of the fertility god Priapus in their gardens for good luck and better harvests, leading some to conclude that this is the precursor of where the garden gnome comes from. By the way, for all of my fellow EMS providers out there, now you know where the term priapism comes from. You can look it up. In Greece, there were earth-dwelling demons that lived underground and rarely came to the surface to interact. And it's theorized that the etymology of the word gnome actually comes from the Greek gnosis, which means earth dweller or knowledge of hidden treasure. Comparisons have been made of gnomes and leprechauns in Irish folklore. And in Scotland, there's a myth of gnome-like creatures who are very strong and were builders of the megaliths. They're known as the Peck.
Can I help you? I'm Walter Peck.
No relation to Walter Peck, but it is true. This man has no. And in Scandinavia, similar mine-dwelling demons would protect gemstones and harass miners with their trickery, perhaps protecting their own domains. Also in Scandinavia, there's the folklore of the Nisse. That's the Norwegian word for them. In Sweden, it's Tomtenisse, and in Finland, it's Tontu. And you've probably seen them all over the place because, fun fact, they are most closely associated with Yuletide and Santa Claus in Scandinavia. And they're called gonk. This little guy is a gonk. He's more of a fall-themed or a regular-themed one. And the fun thing about these gonks, too, is they're always portrayed with their hats over their eyes because they were supposed to be very sensitive to sunlight. Another homage to their underground living. It can be difficult to say which one of these proto-gnomes was the real true precursor to what we consider gnomes established in 1566. One thing's for certain, though. Gnomes tend to be associated with mischievous spirits. They are absolutely passionate and zealous about the things that they love in life and are definitely magical in nature. So it seems like the absolute perfect fit for the D&D world. So when exactly did they show up in Dungeons & Dragons, and how much of the old folklore impacts what we know of as the playable race of gnomes? It appears that gnomes were first mentioned in the original 1974 release of the Dungeons & Dragons box set. They were also mentioned in the 1975 Blackmore expansion, but they were not yet playable characters. You can't mess with that, though. Ugh. From the beginning, even in the early artwork, gnomes were portrayed with a certain sense of whimsy, joy. It would be unusual not to see a gnome smiling or laughing. I mean, look at that fish crossbow. It's just cool. In 1977, gnomes appeared in the Monster Manual, which actually gave them stats and attributes. And since we love to take rules and modify them to suit our own table, it's really easy to conclude that at that point, once there were stats attached to gnomes, probably we were starting to see our first playable characters. And shortly after, in 1978, gnomes showed up as a playable race in the character handbook. Now, another kind of fun factoid about this is that in 1970s, late 70s, garden gnomes were exploding in the United States. And could it be that if garden gnomes were popping up all over the place, this was the kind of pressure needed to include gnomes as a playable race? Or maybe to capitalize on the excitement of gnome mania? It's hard to say, but it sure is fun to speculate about. Since they are a mythical being, from the beginning they tended to focus more heavily on magical resistance, spellcasting ability, and less so on your traditional fighting man, fighting woman sort of adventurer types. As time went on, some of the lore, history, and social connections of gnomes started to take shape. Around this time, there was also the mention of the first Gnomish Subrace, the Svirfneblins. Svirfneblin. The Svirfneblins, or Deep Gnomes. But it wasn't until the era of 2nd edition D&D that we got the first 4 playable subraces of gnomes. Those being the Forest Gnomes, the Rock Gnomes, the Deep Gnomes, Svirfneblin, and the Tinker Gnomes. Now, the Tinker Gnomes are also known as the Krynnish Gnomes, as they come from Krynn, which is the land of the Dragonlance Chronicles. What's interesting about that world is that they've sort of taken the idea of the gnome and split them into 2. You've got your Krynnish Gnomes, which are your more tinkery types, and then you have your Kender. Now, I know what you're all going to say. Kender are just Krynnish halflings. I get it. But the halflings also embody that gnomish sense of curiosity and insatiable enthusiasm. But to put a fine point on it, they are definitely separate. A Krynnish gnome is not a Kender. But back to the 4 subraces. When you do break down those subraces, they do seem to echo and embody the characteristics of the human folklore idea of a gnome into those 4 subraces. In our human lore, gnomes are earth-dwelling faefolk. They mine for gold and jewels, they play pranks on humans, they live underground, and they create fantastical machines. No wonder then that the subraces in D&D lean on these traits. Your forest gnomes share a lot of characteristics of the faefolk. They speak with animals, they understand animals, they live in nature. Deep gnomes are by nature earth-dwelling creatures. They rarely see the light of day. And rock gnomes and tinker gnomes make excellent inventors. As their presence in the game grew, so did the number of subraces. And there are far too many to list here because they're vast and they span all of the different source materials. But in addition, they also developed a bona fide deity pantheon, with at least 8 recognized gnomish deities, most important of which is Garl Glittergold himself. So gnomes are a reflection of how life imitates art, or more specifically, the lovely intersection of art, creativity, fantasy, and history. Gnomes were an excellent addition to D&D, and I can think of no other race that has added so much joy, artistry, and the potential for your absolute wonderful playable characters. They are a blast to play, and they bring so much to your table. They should never be considered two-dimensional. They should never be considered gimmicky. In my next video, I'm going to convince you that gnomes are among the very best characters to choose. I'll explore some character concepts, and I'll show you some of the common pitfalls that people fall into with gnomes that make them feel two-dimensional or gimmicky. We want a gnomish character that celebrates the joy, the mischief, and the eccentricity of the race, without falling into the trap of becoming a two-dimensional Looney Tunes character. And if you want to get a heads up when that video drops, subscribe to the channel. Until next time, I am the Common House Bard. Cheers.